Hi, so welcome everyone. If I understand that the live stream just started. My name is Alex Dunn, and I'm here to sort of open up a session to very excited launch of the Data Futures Lab, which has been lovelily timed with MozFest, which is great because it's been a long time coming, and we're really excited to share with sort of what's been going on behind the scenes to sort of build up to this moment. And we have some fantastic panelists today that are going to sort of talk us through and orient us in this conversation. We're going to start with Anouk Ruhak, who's a senior fellow at Mozilla Foundation, and she has been sort of doing a lot of the heavy lifting of getting the lab up and running and moving. And she's going to talk us through a little bit about what we mean when we say data stewardship, to sort of lay the foundation for us to be able to talk about what it is the Data Futures Lab is going to be doing. And then I'm going to have the opportunity to moderate a conversation between Martin Tisné from Luminate and J. Bob Alotta from Mozilla Foundation, who's the VP of Global Programs. And they're going to be in conversation about, as two of the founding funders of the initiative, why they're involved in it, what they're excited about, and sort of how they see this field changing and how the lab might play a role in moving it forward. So Anouk, I know you've done this a zillion times at this point, but if you could sort of talk us through what is data stewardship, what does the field look like currently, sort of how does the lab fit into this landscape? And then once we hear from you, we'll talk a little bit about the lab itself, and then we'll moderate a conversation between Martin and Bob.
Great. Yes, happy to. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, so data stewardship, just to start with the problem, as I'm sure many of you know, at the moment, a lot of data about us, about our health, about our social behaviors, our relationships, and our environment is collected and used by a handful of very powerful actors. And those are the companies that have the capacity and the knowledge to connect different types of data sources and generate insights that they can use to nudge your behavior or make decisions about what you're allowed to post on social media or whether you can even take out a mortgage. And at the same time, you as an individual often do not have access to similar information, even when it's information about yourself. So needless to say, these companies hold a lot of power. And data stewardship emerged kind of as an idea or concept that could help us rebalance some of that power and give us all greater agency over our data. So what is a data steward? In very brief, it's a person or organization that can help us govern data about ourselves and others, and to do that for our benefit. That's still very vague. So instead of giving more explicit or specific definitions, I wanted to kind of walk you all through what I think are three of the main functions of a data steward, like how they show up. And the first one is kind of a data steward could act as a data equivalent of a doctor. So how does that work? Every time we sign up for services or use digital tools, we make explicitly or implicitly a decision about what data about us we want to share with the tools and the services. And those decisions take a lot of, to make them right, take a lot of knowledge and insights. We need to understand who we're sharing it with, for what purpose they're going to be using it. Can we actually trust them to use it for the way, in the ways they say that they will? So it's a bit like every time you take a sip of water, you have to decide whether that water is safe to drink. And that's a lot of overhead. So instead, we could envision a data steward kind of as a doctor to help us make good decisions that keep us safe. Another role for a data steward could be a bit more like a trade union, but again, for data. So let's say you have decided you want to be active on Clubhouse, you have heard good things and you want to sign up. But as you do, you have some problems with the terms and conditions that Clubhouse imposes on you. So you would love to have a conversation with them and kind of figure out how they can change it so that you can agree with it. But obviously, just calling them up won't get you very far. So what if instead of you acting as a sole individual, a data steward could act on behalf of many users, like many thousands or millions of users of Clubhouse, and negotiate on your behalf. And then that way it acts a bit like a trade union does on behalf of workers. Finally, a third thing I see as a role for a data steward is to facilitate town halls around data. Actual town halls, or sort of figuratively town halls. So far, we've talked about data as something that's very personal, and something that's mostly about you, but actually in reality, most data describes many people. And for instance, and this is the most famous example, your DNA is about you, but it also describes your family members. And it could well be that one of your family members has decided that they really, really want to share their DNA, which is also your DNA, for research because they want help finding a cure for a disease they are struggling with. And yet another family member is adamant that they want to keep their DNA locked up and away from anyone. So how do you negotiate that tension? And obviously that tension doesn't just show up in the realm of a family, it also shows up in society at large. And so I see a role there for data stewards to kind of facilitate that conversation and those negotiations between the different interests and needs around data. So yeah, just to recap, yeah, I think a data steward is someone who governs data on behalf of others, could act as a doctor, could act as a trade union, fighting for our collective rights, or could act a little like a local government, facilitating town halls. Of course, this still leaves a whole lot of questions unanswered. Like the moment you assign a data steward to make decisions for you or act on your behalf, how can you make sure that they will continuously act in your best interests? And what is the legal foundation for the relationship between you and the data steward? What would the technical infrastructure look like, right? What do we build this on? And then the data stewards themselves, how do they come to their decisions? Do you get a say? Do they make them all on their own, kind of like a benevolent dictator? What happens if we disagree with their decisions? So these are a whole lot of questions that a lot of people in this space are working on and trying to figure out, as well as kind of the most urgent question, which is, how do we make this concept reality? How do we take it out of the theoretical realm and manifest it in the world? And as you may guess from all the questions I just asked, that's going to require a whole lot of different skill sets. We're going to need lawyers, we're going to need technologists and governance experts and designers and community builders. And then we need people who can translate between all these different disciplines so they don't stay in their own silos. And these are really hard challenges. But luckily, these are some of the obstacles and challenges that the Data Futures Lab is looking to address. So I'll give it back to Alex to explain a bit more about how that will happen. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Anouk. And I think it's really nice to sort of start with the problem we're trying to solve before launching a solution into the space. So it's really great to ground us on that. So thank you, Anouk. And I'm gonna just a quick question to can I drop a link for everyone that's on the live stream? Sort of how does that work? Because I'm actually going to hit enter on the lab's new site, which can give people a bit of an overview on the lab structure and can be a space for you all to see updates as we roll out lab activities over the next few months. But I don't know if that actually goes to everyone if I drop the link in the chat box. So I will put it here. And then if someone who knows how these things work can share that with people in the audience, that would be great. So I guess technically we just launched the lab. This is how pandemic launches go, I guess. So congratulations, everyone who has been waiting for this moment for quite some time. Lab is launched. I mean, I'd love to just get right into conversation with you, Martin and Bob, because I feel like you have been on a journey to get to this point. And I know there's a lot of activities that are already underway, so it's not like this is the beginning per se, it's kind of somewhere near the end of the beginning. So just sort of situate us in time. But to sort of kick us off, I mean, I'm curious to hear you make your first remarks on this, but sort of why do you think the lab is necessary? So sort of what within your grant making and within your field analysis and within your work as funders made the lab something that you were interested in, something you were passionate about, something that you wanted to participate in building and growing? And I'll start with you, Bob, to sort of take the Mozilla perspective and share that so that Martin can kind of riff off of that from the Luminate side.
Thanks, Alex. I wish that we had thought to like cut to video of a rocket launch or something and like all looked outside. So my bad for not thinking of that sooner, but the cartoon version of us didn't start playing until we were actually in this conversation, so a little late. Yeah, I really appreciate that question, and I'm really excited to be in this conversation. Thank you, Anouk, for that setup. It's really beautiful. And I would say the actual conversation institutionally happened between Mozilla and Luminate and other key fellows, et cetera, before my arrival at Mozilla. So I'm going to actually answer the question in two ways. Like, I think that there's a deep institutional commitment and through like historical through line of why this work is relevant, that honestly, you could probably thread back to our nascency around open, right? Like that it's actually this moment in time where we have some core decisions to make and the opportunity to make them about disrupting the ways things are currently operating that is more collective, puts people at first, and is actually open in its ethos around the valuation, commodification, and extraction of data. My personal interest is twofold. It is very rare that we actually have an opportunity to deal so obviously with root cause. We're always called to deal with root cause. Like if any of the systemic issues that we're trying to rectify requires us to go to root cause, but it's very rare to actually be able to see so granularly and have the opportunity to go there. And that's what I see as our opportunity around data in this stage. And so I feel compelled as someone who identifies as a movement strategist who really is looking at what it means to shift power in ways that rectify harms and actually create like the opportunity for right livelihood. It's those calls are very simple, right? The calls for mattering, the calls for like to live freely, like that's a very simple call, but the solution often feels very complicated. And so I feel excited by what it means to actually have access at a base level in a way that typically we don't. So that's Bob's answer. The other thing that I would say institutionally, and I think, and I'll pass it over to Martin, is that I think when we look at the Data Futures Lab specifically, I think it's a calling for us to bring the best of what we do forward. So we already grant make, we already convene, we already do research, we already network, we're already committed to an open ethos, and we know we can't do any of the work we're endeavoring to do alone, right? And so this is actually like a gorgeous design proposition of like, okay, then how can we do it in the service of the future of data in this format that actually brings all of that to the fore? And I think that's from a programmatic design perspective, that's also what's super exciting about the lab and why it's such a relevant endeavor for Mozilla.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Bob. And Martin, do you want to sort of, from Luminate's perspective, from your perspective, so what was the impetus and where is your excitement coming from?
Cool, thanks, Alice. I mean, the impetus and the passion and the excitement is that we have a massive, problem to solve, not to crack, and I don't think anyone right now really knows how to crack it. And the issue is that a lot, not all, but a lot of our problems when it comes to the impact of data on society are collective problems as well as individual problems. So if you look at the impact of the data used by Cambridge Analytica around Facebook in the run-up to the Brexit referendum in the UK, that ended up to a problem around democracy, which is a fundamentally collective problem. Now, there are also individual problems. You suffer as a result as an individual of data discrimination, and so you don't get a job, But the issue right now is that most of the solutions that exist, they're individualistic. Like the policy solutions, the entire notion of data protection, as we understand it now, rests on the foundations of individual consent as the foundation stone, and they are individualist by nature. a lot of the thinking in the tech world and you know, in various iterations has also been, and I think like way too much, individualist. You should own your data as a person. If you owned your data and created a walled garden around your data, everything would be fine. Well, it turns out probably won't be fine, but you know, and all this is right now quite theoretical, but regardless on one's view around the pros and cons of sort of like personal data ownership, I think there's a fundamental issue in the fact that we have a problem definition, which is both individual, like I get cut out of a job as a result of data about me, and a problem that is collective, right? Data about me and other people is messing around lives for groups. Some people I've never known is messing around democracy in different ways, and yet the solutions are very individualized. So for me, the question that we're trying to solve here, the question that we're asking, you know, that we may or not solve, but comes some way towards solving, it may not be solvable, but will come some way towards solving it, is like, what is the collective solution? What does that look like? And so I think that what I'm excited about when it comes, one of the things I'm excited about when it comes to the Data Futures Lab is at least at the very beginning, coming back to the 3 points that Anouk made, like on the trade union for data, you know, how do we solve the collective action problem when it comes to data? What does that look like in practice? And so let's start from that and then build up, rather than being sort of overly theoretical with sort of, you know, concepts and frameworks around the sort of policy side of collective rights, which I hope will come, but it would be better if they were built on this practice that's developed in the lab and elsewhere. That helps?
Yes, very much. And I want to get a little bit, I mean, this is and Bob, you mentioned this is sort of a design challenge from a program design perspective, as well as a sort of political challenge in broader society. We're not the only ones working on this issue or the only ones affected by this issue. But I'm wondering, you both have really interesting backgrounds working across movements and coalitions and organizations trying to accomplish something, but with different incentives and trying to sort of come together and do something, move something in a different direction. So I'm thinking, Martin, you know, your work on open government partnership and sort of the work in that space. I realize you're in a different field now, but there's some sort of instrumental aspects of that feel really, they rhyme. They're not necessarily similar, but there's something I find interesting in that. And Bob, you know, you work on movement building, and I find it interesting. Sort of the two of you come from. You're both very interested in collaborative endeavor, but you come at it from some slightly different fields and politics. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about coming into the Data Futures Lab, thinking about those design questions, thinking about the nature of the challenge. Sort of what do you bring? How do you see this this challenge? What have you learned from that prior work? And sort of what do you bring to this in terms of your own personal thinking and sort of trajectory? And I'm happy for either of you to field. Also, feel free to take a second and think about it.
Bob, do you want to
start? Martin.
No, go for it, my friend.
Okay. Thank you. A lot of different thoughts on that topic. I mean, one of them, Alex, like just from a network building perspective, a long time ago now, I was very tangentially involved in the growth of what then became the open budget movement. And 2 or 3 years ago, when I started looking in more detail at conversations around data trust and data stewardship and different data governance models, it reminded me of that moment around open budgets when you had organizations and individuals across the world sort of hitting at the same issue and trying to sort of figure out what the solution was. And in open budget, it was in South Africa and in Brazil and in Texas and in Indonesia and in India. And then the question then, and what I think the open budget movement successfully managed to do, was to create an international conversation that was rooted in local, country, regional experiences, and without sort of, you know, cookie cutter, dumbly like replicating it worked there, so it must work somewhere else. Like had a conversation which was about knowledge and learning, and it took 20 years. You know, it's still ongoing. And it seemed to me, again, like 2 or 3 years ago, looking at data stewardship, that we were at the cusp of such a moment, and that if there wasn't an effort to try and, you know, thicken the mesh of this nascent network, that it might end up with really isolated conversations, like great ones, but somewhat isolated conversations taking place in North America, taking place in India, taking place in Southern Africa, in Europe, and elsewhere. And I think the difference between what we're going through now and the work on open budgets is that just like the pace of innovation in the data field is just much faster. And it felt to me that unless we moved relatively fast to create something like the Data Futures Lab, basically the corporates would be just like, well ahead of the game, a step, 2 steps, 3 steps ahead of the game. And we needed to, create the resiliency within this network to be able to counter that. So that's one example.
Yeah, that's interesting. Bob, either thoughts on that, or do you want to share a little bit about sort of how you come to the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think my motivation is similar in terms of the opportunity to be catalytic, and then also to take care. Like, I think similarly, like, I think to Martin's point, it's clear that there's all of this work all over the globe springing up around this, right? We did, the tiniest peek out into the window and landed on so many different projects that are happening. Many of those projects and attempts at fleshing out different governance models, interrogations of data, looking at collectivity, starting from a collectivity and then looking out, right? There's all of this work. And then I guess it's my motivation to kind of look around the room and say, what does responsibility look like in this moment, and how can that work get fostered? I think the looming speed and precision at which corporations can move is very real, as Martin points out, right? And so I think none of us are confused about that. And so I think in my mind, then what's the responsibility and role of philanthropy potentially in that space? And so that is both to resource and get out of the way, like to resource and create a viable container for work to grow. And then I think we also have like the ability to work collectively together to like model what we're saying is actually meaningful. And so that's really why the Data Futures Lab also is a collaborative model and a collaboration in that regard. And really respecting that it isn't about creating the greatest common denominator or making everything palatable for everyone. Even amongst Luminate and Mozilla, we don't necessarily have to have the same theories of change. We have to agree to be working on this work and see that it's important, even if we're quite aligned. So in my mind, what I think and I absolutely assume that the most innovative work happens often in the least resourced places. And that innovation, capital I innovation, is usually the commodification of things that are actually innovative. I also feel really excited about bringing unlikely folks into the room into a same room, into shared space, allowing for that learning to happen in a way that I wouldn't have, right? If I'm working on a project and you're working on a project over there and I'm not privy to that, like that is a very different experience than if I actually become privy to what's happening in the back end. If the work that I'm doing is actually useful for projects down the road on the other side of the world, like that's very meaningful, and that takes resource in order to create an environment for that. And that compels me from a philanthropic perspective as well as an activist perspective. Like I think that that's actually something that we can do, and it's the basic tenet of the lab.
Yeah, that's great. Martin, I saw you unmute. I didn't know if you wanted to jump in with something Bob said.
It was just like, it's like riffing, it's riffing on our different experiences. I mean, I think like there's learning from things that worked, and there's learning from things that didn't work in different ways. And I think, you mentioned the open government work. I was also quite involved in a lot of open data work at the beginning of the 2010s. And I think there's something, you need to be really cautious about trends and terms that become kind of trendy, like open data did, and like data trusts, risk being right now. And I think that one of the important learnings and what we need to try and do, and like be held to account by all of you, is to tread a fine line between neither being sort of techno-utopians or techno-skeptics, So we need to be, we need to be sort of somewhere in the middle there. And I think for a bunch of different reasons, I mean, I really like Anouk's introduction and the different things that like data trusts and data stewardship models can enable us to do. We need to be alive as to the unintended consequences, right? When it comes to data trust specifically, I think it's potentially exciting. And there's also a big risk that they could reinforce majority or powerful minority rule rather than empowering marginalized communities. So let's really test it and figure out how it would work. I also think that it's a model, the whole data stewardship model could really easily be captured by existing platforms, right? There's a massive advantage potentially for the dominant platforms. How do we avoid that being the case? We were talking about, the legal foundations. I know you were talking about the legal foundations. You were talking about how do data stewards make decisions. Others have talked about like a professional class of data trustees. How do we ensure that that isn't the monopoly of like the big law firms, or the monopoly of the big tech giants? And then likewise, I think a third big question is if we are moving towards the sort of the union model, and these stewardship models are quite specialized, like there's one for your Uber driver, there's one for, your professional life, and then there's one for your healthcare, and then there's one for education. Do you then end up in a sort of parallel situation than the one we're in today, where it's just like overwhelming? So it then becomes unmanageable. So rather than actually delegating the responsibility to data fiduciary or other, you're actually giving up your control rather than regaining it. So I think there's like some really big, exciting, meaty questions, and they really need interrogation, which is, skeptical at times, excited at others, but definitely both.
Yeah, I would just piggyback on that and say that the best way for those questions to get answered and tested is for the largest amount of folks to be testing and answering those questions, right? And so I think that that's also part of why we're really looking at the robust networks of practice engaging around this work, right? And so that I deeply assume that the answers to those questions will come wherever we least assume that those answers come. But if we don't upend the script, right? If there's only, we're very clear to your point, Martin, around the large platforms. They remain the large platforms unless we, who will subsume those answers unless we actually build a robust enough field and listen to the folks who are already interrogating those very questions.
Yeah, super interesting. And I mean, Bob, you talked a little bit about this, and I guess Martin, you touched on it a little bit, but obviously this is one part of other things that your organizations are doing, and sort of this situates interestingly with other work in your foundations. And I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on sort of the priority of data stewardship and how it sits with other priorities, because I think it's useful to kind of orient people in thinking about how to sort of see how you're thinking about things. So Martin, I think in the context of data and digital rights, sort of how you see data stewardship situated, and then Bob, sort of how you see in the foundation and its directions around trustworthy AI and other aspects, sort of where this work kind of sits. Would be great to hear a little bit more about.
Oh, do you want to kick off?
Martin.
Me? You want me to kick off? I'm happy to do that.
Go for it. Yeah. You're unmuted. You do it.
So I think that the way it's situated, it's a little bit, well, it's more than a little bit. It's the way that I was talking about it earlier, which is it's around the notion of collective data rights, right? And collective data responsibilities and what the solution there looks like. So we have, within our work on data and digital rights, we have a chunk of that, which is around understanding the nature of the problem on the collective side, understanding the impact of data-driven interventions on society and on democracy, in a number of ways. So we have a sort of, we have a research wing to that, where we fund research in a number of different countries. And we have a big priority for that research and the understanding of the problems to not just be Anglo understandings, both meaning like geographically, but also in the English speaking world. And then we have another part of that, that's the first part. We have another part of that, which is on the policy side. Like, what's the legislation that's needed? Like, what are the policy pieces that need to fit together for us to be able to exercise, our collective rights when it comes to data? So we have a number of different organizations we work with on that side. And then the third piece is the doing bit. So this is where I see this fitting in, which is fundamentally about collective action. So how does it work in practice to have a number of different actors? So, be they Uber drivers or others, could they be sort of, consumers, working with Consumer Report or Which Magazine or Que Choisir in France or others, exercising collective action when it comes to their data rights, and what does that look like at a practical level? So that's how it fits in from our perspective. I mentioned it in a sort of 1, 2, 3 piece. It's not a sequence. We're doing those 3 simultaneously. And as I mentioned earlier, I would be very excited to see this piece of work. I am excited to see this piece of work take off, and then the sort of the policy bits that we're working on building on this. I mean, to give you one sort of specific example, part of what we're looking at on the policy side is around like indigenous data sovereignty, and looking at the parallels between indigenous people's rights and data rights. We're looking with my colleagues, Swiling Harris and Salman Ahmed, at organizations working in Cambodia and elsewhere on that. So we're trying to understand how this works in a number of different settings, and excited to see how people who are actually doing it can be part of the solution. That makes sense?
Yeah, that's great. And Bob, do you want to talk a little bit about where this sits for Mozilla?
Sure. Certainly this is the core focus of the lab, but it sits within the organization itself. So the foundation, if I kind of zoom out a little bit, obviously, like we're working for an open and free internet or internet health. We have a strategic focus on trustworthy AI. And then specifically, we're looking at data stewardship as it relates to the lab, but also as Martin mentioned, from a policy perspective, organizationally, and also looking at our own data stewardship, and how are we functioning? How are we walking the walk or talking the talk? And so there's work to be done there. I wouldn't say that we have arrived. I think we have a really healthy interrogation of where we're at and trying to figure that out as this work becomes more and more robust, and then thinking about how that actually, how can we model internally and work with our colleagues sector-wide around that kind of work. I suspect our policy work overlaps in terms of jurisdictions that we're thinking about. There's a lot happening right now, whether it's in the UK, in the US, in India, in Brazil, et cetera, in Germany. So I think that there's a lot. The EU writ large, so there's a lot happening there. Also, in terms of trustworthy AI, we have a core commitment at the moment looking at what bias, the impact of bias on AI, on transparency, on how that implicates trustworthy AI. And we do all of that with a movement building lens and framework. And so even if you, again, bringing it back to the lab, the design of the lab is meant to foster that kind of cross-movement partnership. These issues are ubiquitous across movements, as technology is, and how are we showing up as a partner, and with whom do we need to be working? What's our concept of our base, and how does that continue to grow? And then how do we learn and evolve with other movements whose primary issues overlap really with ours? So that's kind of framework-wise how that exists for us institutionally.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I feel like, I mean, as funders, you all have spent quite a bit of time sort of getting up to speed in this field, building networks in this field, understanding this field, thinking about this field of data stewardship and sort of its intersection with your organizational priorities. And I'm wondering if you, I mean, I'm assuming that there's some funders watching this that are sort of data stewardship curious. And I'm wondering sort of in that learning journey, what do you want funders, other funders and philanthropic institutions to be thinking about when they see data stewardship as a problem and as a field and as a set of possible sort of solutions and directions, because I think it is something that can be misfunded pretty dramatically. And so I want to sort of, recognizing that you all have built this expertise and have spent time working on understanding these issues, I'd love to hear from you about sort of if you could share some insights or some words of wisdom / caution to other funders that might be interested in this. It'd be great.
I'll start. I mean, the first thing that I'd want them to think about is joining us, right? I think that this is like, to be frank, like I think it's important. Like if we're looking at the ability to work together, if we're talking about a body of work that centers collaboration and collectivity, I think we should be working together, right? Like just that's the bottom line. And also I think that our reach then gets to be really that much more broad and that much more impactful. So that's my first thing. And then the other thing, and I actually have kind of assumed this from a respect standpoint. So I'm just probably underscoring what people are already thinking, but there's not this one answer, right? There isn't like the win, right? Like I think that it's really about iterating opportunities and really looking at kind of a level of specificity and relevance for certain communities, for certain geographies, for certain jurisdictions, for certain technical protocols that then could establish themselves. And as Martin said earlier, and I think we can't say it enough, like to fund so that folks can fail and get back up again and try, like that trying is so critically important. And so there's like, I don't know that something may not work, but that doesn't mean that it's a failure, right? Like, so I think that that's a really different way to be thoughtful about the work. But then to look at how are we allowing the opportunity, like what's the purview that we can help afford so that something that works in a specific use case can be broadly applied, and so like that's the bridge I think that we have the opportunity to help build. And so that's from a funder's perspective, like why I think it's important for us to all be in communication. I deeply assume that somebody on this call has a viewpoint is working with some folks who we don't know anything about, like, and so that's actually like the point of creating one kinetic moment in this body of work for folks to interact and connect.
Martin?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Thanks, Alex. Plus one to everything Bob says. And yes, please join us. And join us to do what? I would say to help us think through, and even if you don't join us, to think through these three questions, right? How do we ensure that data stewardship solutions don't contribute to growing rampant inequality is one. How do we ensure that the data stewardship solutions aren't majoritarian, like the rest of certainly like the social media web? And three, how do we ensure that they're not monopolistic? I mean, those are three amongst the other things that are messing up the world right now: inequality, majoritarianism, and the monopolies, the data monopolies in this case. And so unpacking those a little bit, when it comes to contributing to even greater inequality, I worry a lot, and I would hope other funders would sort of, worry as well and help us all think it through, that there is a real risk that data stewardship solutions could be geared towards those people who have more time, those who are more tech literate, those who have better internet connections, and that could even increase their privilege even more. That is a very easy path to go down. It's the path that we're on. it's the path of least resistance, and that worries me a lot. And the second one is, how do we ensure that it doesn't further increase majoritarianism? I mean, one of the reasons that automated decision-making systems are so messed up, for example, when it comes to delivery of public services and others, is that they focus on what the majority wants and then ignore, you know, sort of like if you're part of a minority, if you're a group that is sort of like less clearly represented, you're ignored. You don't exist. Your group doesn't exist itself. And so I think that's a real question for us. It's a huge question for us to wrestle with. And then the other one I mentioned earlier, which is, how do we help ensure that these solutions don't end up being monopolistic? You know, it goes to Bob, your point about the solutions being open, points Anouk made earlier as well. And it's easy to say, you know, in a sort of, you know, civil society and sort of, you know, B Corp type setting, but it's going to be really hard to implement in practice, because if this stuff really works, like the big tech platforms and the big players are going to be all over it in half a second. So I think, like, please help us think through these questions, and just, you know, think them through even if you don't join us.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Well, we only have a few minutes left. And Bob, I wanted to give you a chance to say thanks to all the people that are making this possible. I mean, I realize it's lovely to see the two of you in conversation, because I know that you've been just instrumental in getting this thing off the ground. But I know that there's so many other people involved, and so I don't want to give them short shrift. So I'd love for you to just have a few minutes to reflect on that and close us out.
Sure. I'm going to forget someone, so you should save me from shame and jump in if you see that I have. But first of all, thank you, Alex, who've been really instrumental. Thank you for this conversation and have been a beautiful advisor to this project. I want to thank Sui-Ling Harris, also from Luminate, and Mark Sermon, who were like in the weeds with us deeply, or maybe even invented the weeds. Katie Knight and Laura Mayer from the Siegel Family Fund, who's a core collaborator and part of the Data Futures Lab. Our senior fellows, you met Anouk, but also Sylvie Delacroix and Richard Witt, who've been integral to fleshing this out even in its most nascent stages. The Proto Lab staff, Lindsay Dotson, Mehan Jayasuriya, and Melissa Huerta, who's working on this earlier. I want to welcome, actually, we have hired a new lab lead who's gotten to troll this event, but you're going to be front and center pretty soon, my friend. So Champika Fernand, if you're out there, feel free to wave if we're smart enough to unface mute you well enough. But in any case, you'll be hearing from Champika so much, and we're really thrilled to have you join us. I can't remember anyone else to thank, but I do want to also point people to the science fair, because it's brilliant and it's in spatial chat, and you can meet our Proto Lab grantee partners who are really super wonderful, and you can see demos from all of them. Alex, I'm going to ask you to point people towards the schedule where folks can find yes. Okay. So so if you go to foundation.mozilla.org, if you /data-futures-labs, you'll see our events page, and you can go in there, and please do join us. Please join us for all of the rest of the sessions, and big ups to everyone who is even willing to wrestle with the notion of stewarding data in different directions. So thank you so much.
And on my side, Alex, if I say quickly, a huge thanks to you, Bob. Huge thanks to Alex, to my colleague Sui-Ling Harris, who I don't think is with us today. I hope she's not in a way because she's on leave, but Sui-Ling might never let us be there. But huge thanks to her. Thank you to Mark Sermon also for the early ideation on this. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so with that, I call this lab launch closed, and now we can get to work.
Rockets, rockets, rockets.
Yeah, rockets. There's so many rockets.
Rockets.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Awesome.
everybody.
Yeah, thank you.